I'm taking the privilege to comment to the session, the important session we've heard now. And I just want to remind everyone, I don't know if everyone know about it, but I know that in Lithuania there was a decree that women can't have births and they have to take abortions. And this is a clear policy. It's not a question. This is the first clear policy, I think, which was going all around all the ghettos in Lithuania. And if you think about the date, it was on February 1942, immediately after the Wannsee conference. So it's very interesting, and I'm sure there was at this time, there was a whole conception to kill the babies before even the Jewish women have a birth, and thousands of abortions were taken. So I look at like it was a specific extermination camps to children. But this is for another lecture. So today now we are come again to look about the British angle in World War II and the Holocaust. And the first lecture will deal with the topic of Holocaust and the rescue, Impotent or Indifferent, Anglo-Jewry, 1938-1945. And the lecturer is Pamela Shatzkes. I hope I say it right. And she received her master's and doctorate degrees from London School of Economics and Political Science, where she taught international history for several years. Today's lecture, which is the title of her book, presents a radical reappraisal of the Anglo-Jewry's involvement in rescue and relief work during the Holocaust. It challenges the widely held view, which condemns as a weak and half-hearted Anglo-Jewish efforts on behalf of European Jews during the Nazi period. She first presented this lecture alongside Sir Martin Gilbert as co-host at a conference in London. This event marked her initial discussion of her book, where she warmly remembers the support Sir Martin provided. In 2017, Pamela made Aliyah, and more recently, her focus of research is on the effort of retrieve Jewish war orphans in Western Europe after the Holocaust. Pamela, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. One of the subjects still fiercely debated by Holocaust researchers is the attitude of the bystander nations towards the plight of Jews in Nazi Europe. The broad agreement is that the Allied countries were indifferent and maybe even complicit in the destruction of European Jewry by their willful immigration restrictions and apathetic rescue attempts. An important element in this criticism of the bystander nations and a partial explanation for their relative inaction has to be held to be the failure of their organized Jewish communities to exert pressure on their governments. The popular as well as the scholarly perception of Anglo-Jewry during this period is a negative one. Disunity, insecurity, misplaced priorities, and a fear of rising anti-Semitism are blamed for a poor response to the endangered Jews of Europe. The work of Anglo-Jewry in facilitating the arrival of over 50,000 refugees between 1933 and 1939 has sometimes been described as a model of charitable endeavor, but more commonly by revisionist historians as a half-hearted effort cramped by insecurity and self-interest. Most scholars argue that Anglo-Jewry failed to react to the wartime catastrophe with the resolution and vigor that might have saved more lives. Re-examining the existing evidence and exploring new sources has convinced me that on the whole, Anglo-Jewry was not as insecure and small-minded a community as has been depicted. People like the Rothschilds, the Montefioris, and the Herbert Samuels represented a confident, well-integrated community which tackled the escalating problems of refugee immigration in the 1930s with compassion, common sense, and an administrative expertise born of a long tradition of communal charity. This achievement is all the more remarkable measured against the scale of the disaster, the constraints of British immigration policy regulations, and a chronic lack of funds. Anglo-Jewry was equally far from indifferent to the tragedy of European Jewry during wartime, but as I will show, its politically naive and inexperienced leadership had a poor grasp of the dynamics of negotiation and was an easy prey to the highly sharpened skills of the Home Office, Foreign Office, and Colonial Office mandarins with whom they were so unevenly matched. Their administrative skills remained valuable in areas of relief work, such as facilitating humane treatment and conditions for internees during the internment period in 1940 and the parcel schemes to occupied Europe from 1942. But understandably, their very preoccupation with the Jewish catastrophe resulted in a fatal loss of focus, which meant that they rigidly pursued aims which were, in practice, unrealistic. We can divide this topic into two distinct periods, during which Anglo-Jewry was called upon to play different roles for which it was not equally qualified. In the pre-war years, its role was administrative and primarily fundraising. In April 1933, after Hitler's accession to power that January, the Anglo-Jewish leadership took an unprecedented step, which led the cabinet to modify the rule that immigrants must demonstrate financial independence. It made a formal commitment to the British government that the Jewish community would undertake full responsibility for the care and maintenance of Jewish refugees who would thus not become a burden on public resources. Between 1933 and 1939, the Anglo-Jewish community raised more than £3 million. That's the equivalent of around £90 million at today's value. An impressive sum for a community of just over 330,000, especially during an economic depression. It was purely because of this commitment and the subsequent financial support of the Anglo-Jewish community that the British government allowed the admission of over 50,000 German Jewish refugees throughout the 1930s. Among the first refugee organizations established was the Jewish Refugee Committee, founded by Otto Schiff in March 1933, and the Central British Fund for German Jewry, the main funding body for refugee work. With the deteriorating conditions of German Jewry following the Nuremberg laws in 1935 and Kristallnacht in November 1938, efforts accelerated. Most memorably, the movement for the care of refugee children, better known as the Kindertransport, brought some 10,000 children to Britain between 1938 and 1939. These Anglo-Jewish organizations, mainly made up of voluntary workers, are frequently charged with formulating selection procedures which discriminated against some of the very refugees they were supposed to rescue. The government had relied entirely on the organization's selection procedures in granting visas. But originally in 1933, they believed that the total would not exceed more than 3,000 to 4,000. Only when numbers reached unmanageable levels did choices have to be made. Following Kristallnacht, the Home Office agreed to accept certain categories of refugees, including children, elderly, and trans migrants, without case-by-case scrutiny, based on these organizations' recommendations. Yet guarantees of maintenance were still needed, which meant prioritizing those who could be guaranteed by family or friends, and those like the young who could be retrained prior to reimmigration. There is still much criticism of this policy of selectivity. The simple fact is that the human and financial resources required to deal with the disaster were hugely beyond anything Anglo-Jewry had anticipated or could cope with. It should also be stressed that no one in the 1930s could have foreseen the development of Nazi policy of extermination towards the Jews. Interestingly, in spite of this selectivity, if you take the crucial year 1939, there is a significant discrepancy between the number of visas issued and actual arrivals. Overall, around 80,000 visas were issued, yet far fewer than this number came to Britain. We don't know why so many visas remained unused. It isn't known how many of those who arrived had simply failed to register. Certainly, many refugees experienced difficulties in winding up their affairs in Germany and securing the necessary permission to leave. Some probably obtained visas as an insurance policy, which they held until it was too late to cash in. But there were certainly still many thousands of visa holders who legally could have entered Britain in the months before the outbreak of war and did not do so. How Anglo-Jewry could have coped is another matter, but these people were not turned away. Coming to the war years now, the Anglo-Jewish leadership of the 1940s has been turned into a symbolic scapegoat. Instead of acknowledging the obstacles facing it, historians have demonized a diffident and insecure leadership which put its own selfish interests ahead of its moral responsibilities to its European brethren. Following the outbreak of war, Anglo-Jewry found itself in an even more difficult position. With all aliens from enemy countries barred from entering Britain for security reasons, the organizations were no longer required to assist in selection and settlement of refugees. The skills needed were no longer administrative, except for those already in the country and during the internment period, but they were now political. Critics have repeatedly attacked Anglo-Jewry for doing little to save the doomed Jews of Europe. These critics argue that Anglo-Jewry should have shouted from the rooftops using a policy of activism. Today we call it pressure politics, mass lobbying, public demonstrations, as we all know too well. But in effect, a politically powerless Anglo-Jewry was able to do nothing but use negotiation and persuasion to try to convince the government to change its restrictive policy or to take action the leadership itself could not take. It was also up against the government's intractable refusal to admit that European Jews constituted a special case in terms of rescue and relief. This was one of the reasons why the government invariably opposed the organization's appeal for declarations or warnings, emphasizing the plight of the Jews. For reasons of principle as well as policy, the government was reluctant to recognize a Jewish national identity. This, they argued, would reinforce German propaganda about the Allies being engaged in a Jewish war, complicate Britain's Palestine policy, and create problems of post-war repatriation. After the news of the Nazi genocide plan, the final solution broke in the summer of 1942 and was confirmed later that year, the Anglo-Jewish leadership mobilized and presented numerous proposals to the government. A day of mourning and a fast with services in synagogues culminating in a public demonstration were arranged. Delegates lobbied the government to stimulate parliamentary debates and seek the mediation of the Pope. It was suggested that Palestine be opened up to unlimited numbers of refugees, that approaches be made to the protecting powers, neutral countries, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The importance of wide publicity was considered vital, including broadcasts on the BBC's European services and leaflets dropped over Germany. It was also suggested that Jews in the Polish ghettos be granted prisoner of war status. Following the December 1942 joint Allied declaration, in which uniquely crimes against Jews had been emphasized, the Anglo-Jewish organizations repeatedly pressed the government for further warnings of retribution, hoping for specific mention of Jews. However, the British government invariably refused, maintaining that declarations were ineffective and potentially damaging. Most other suggestions made by the Anglo-Jewish leadership proved abortive because of the demands of Britain's wartime priorities and the government's rigid insistence of no negotiation with the enemy. Officials constantly maintained that the only means of helping European Jews was an Allied victory. The corollary of this was the overriding imperative of supporting everything else to the war effort. This insistence, above all, rendered Anglo-Jewish efforts almost wholly futile. Timing, of course, didn't help. The most disastrous periods in the European Jewish tragedy coincided with the greatest pressure on the British and Allied governments, so the persistence of the Jewish organizations occurred at times when it was least likely to be met sympathetically. This is evident in the winter of 1942, when the news of the final solution was confirmed just as the North African military operation was underway. Again, in the summer of 1944, the Hungarian deportations coincided with the Allied D-Day landings. Moreover, that June, the Nazis resumed their air assault against London. Anglo-Jewry's distracting demands would have been a nuisance even in peacetime. In wartime, Anglo-Jewish efforts were doubly unwelcome, an irritant to government officials bound by realpolitik rather than an ethical politics, a post-Second World War concept. Furthermore, Anglo-Jewish leaders lacked the necessary diplomatic and negotiating skills needed to influence the government. Notwithstanding their good intentions, an element of naivete and short-termism characterized much of their approach. The Anglo-Jewish leadership seemed unable to understand the dynamics of global war and incapable of interpreting the subtle and complex calculations with which officials treated its requests. Nevertheless, the leadership's lack of political expertise was secondary to the near insurmountable nature of the task. It has to be stressed, sadly, that the annihilation of European Jewry was a central German war aim. Preventing it was not an Allied war aim. If anything, it was argued, it would actively interfere with the central Allied war aim of winning the war in the quickest possible time. The Anglo-Jewish leadership was never able to overcome bureaucratic red tape and intransigence, as demonstrated by its failure to change, among other things, British immigration policy to Palestine, which was based on the White Paper of May 1939, as well as immigration to Britain, shipping, and relaxation of the blockade rules. The official documents of this period revealed the government's politely concealed impatience at the narrow-minded political naivety of Jewish representatives who were sagely offering diplomatically phrased advice on aspects of the conduct of war without regard to logistics or possible consequences. For example, one document records a meeting between Professor Zelig Brodetsky, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and his assistant, Adolf Brotman, at the Foreign Office in January 1943. They urged an approach to Germany to release Jews and to suggest Allied and neutral countries afford transportation and sanctuary. The document betrays a latent irritation and contempt beneath an apparently objective surface. Richard Law, a Foreign Office official, noted, and I quote, "They then attacked me on the general question. I spoke to them very strongly. They said, of course the war must come first, but they kept harping back to mass movements running into tens of thousands, which showed clearly enough that they were not really impressed by the difficulties. I repeated that it was an international problem," unquote. In the art of negotiation, bargaining is a process of adjustment and compromise between parties for mutual gains. Here there was no mutual gain and nothing at all for the government. Brodetsky and Brotman came in with unrealistically inflated demands for mass movements running into tens of thousands rather than starting low and only gradually raising the stakes. Most damaging, there is no negotiation going on, but only repetition of two intractable and incompatible positions, with Brodetsky and Brotman harping back instead of moving on, and Law simply repeating, it was an international problem. Notwithstanding their good intentions, many other examples illustrate the political naivete, vagueness, and impracticality of the Anglo-Jewish leadership. Here are just a few more examples. Following the joint Allied December 17, 1942 declaration promising retribution for war crimes, Brodetsky advised that, and I quote, "The German government should be told through some appropriate channel that Jews, especially women and children, should be allowed to leave all countries under German control," unquote, as though Hitler was likely to be scolded into capitulation. Another suggestion was that refugees be accorded the status of British protected persons for exchange purposes. Apart from the unlikelihood that this would impress the Nazis, there was still no reason for the British authorities to give precedence to purported British protected persons at the expense of real ones. Nor were shipping proposals well presented. Vague requests for shipping were made instead of a thoroughly detailed, properly costed, specific single shipping scheme, what we now call a feasibility study, and with us easy to brush aside on the grounds of severe shortages. Even sound ideas were not followed through. Important points of detail, such as the dangers of sailing without a guarantee of safe conduct from the German government, were not addressed. This made it simple for the British government to use these details to block the idea as a whole. Besides, where were these refugees and where were they supposed to go? One last one. In January 1944, Brodetsky missed another chance. He killed off his own suggestion that neutral states might be persuaded to accept numbers of refugees by insisting that these refugees would not want to be repatriated after the war, which was, of course, what the government in neutral states would have required. There was an unquestionable deficiency in the caliber of the Anglo-Jewish leadership during the war. It could boast no inspired, imaginative, or charismatic figures. Brodetsky, president of the Board of Deputies, the official body representing Anglo-Jewry, is a central figure. What sort of man was he? He held the chair of applied mathematics at Leeds University and was well known for his work in the field of aerodynamics. He was both a dedicated Zionist and an impractical and idealistic academic, yet obliged to play politics in wartime. Without detracting from his moral integrity and commitment, one has to say that he was quite unqualified for his task. Perhaps the fact that he was a mathematician, dealing with abstract concepts, pure theory, rather than an empirical scientist with trial and error in light of experiments, had a lot to do with his failure to grasp the shifting realities of the wartime drama. When strong argument was needed to counter the evasions of the Foreign Office, he was both powerless and oddly lacking in insight. Now the big question, could negotiation ever have succeeded? Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld, head of the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council and better known today as the founder of the Jewish Day School movement in Britain, pursued small-scale rescue schemes with a unique blend of daring and subtlety. His pre-war evacuation of many hundreds of endangered Jews from Germany and Austria is well known. During the war, Schonfeld proved himself masterly at inventing options for mutual gains or dovetailing different interests, as exemplified by his Mauritius scheme. This involved securing visas from the British government for the island of Mauritius. Possession of these visas or any other visas sometimes provided invaluable protection for their holders in Nazi-occupied Europe and helped avoid deportation, at least in the short term, even if the holders never reached Mauritius. At the same time, the scheme also served a governmental purpose by deflecting criticism of the British treatment of Jewish immigrants from Palestine that were being held in Mauritius since 1940. Schonfeld was skillful at capitalizing on chance opportunities by exploiting the interests of the Colonial Office to facilitate this scheme. He knew that harping on Palestine, as others had done, would subvert his immediate short-term aim of saving lives. His gradual approach, starting with a small number, a list of 30 names, and gradually increasing it to 100 until finally reaching over 1,000, was the key to its success. By contrast, Brodetsky thought in all or nothing terms. Witness his impractical suggestion that the entire Jewish population of occupied Europe could be transferred to neutral countries. To sum up then, the Anglo-Jewish leadership was far from indifferent to the tragedy of European Jewry. The organizations achieved remarkable successes in the pre-war years, combining their administrative expertise with a financial guarantee of maintenance to accomplish the rescue of over 50,000 Jewish refugees. By tragic contrast, their lack of political and diplomatic experience during wartime rendered them almost entirely incapable of influencing an intransigent government engaged in global war to save Jewish lives. A non-Jewish refugee activist noted for her confrontational style, the independent member of parliament, Eleanor Rathbone, admitted that she and her colleagues, quote, found it impossible to impress on the government either the moral necessity or the logistical possibility of rescue, unquote. And so it seems unlikely that any difference in leadership style would have changed official policy. Nevertheless, the reputation of the Jewish leadership might have been enhanced had it possessed the necessary political skills to put up a more dynamic, concerted, and resourceful challenge to government intransigence. Still, for all their lackluster abilities, in the end, they were caught up in a great tragedy, and as such, I believe, worthy of respect. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much, Pamela, for this important lecture. And to stay with the time, I will invite immediately, and maybe we will have a response later at the end. So Dr. Bernice Lerner, she is the next lecturer, and she is going to speak about a race against time, the British Second Army and the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. She is the author of All the Horrors of War, a Jewish Girl, a British Doctor, and the Liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and other writings on the Holocaust and on virtue ethics. She is the former Dean of Adult Learning at Hebrew College, the former Director of the Center for Character and the Social Responsibility at Boston University, and the lecturer on the Holocaust and on character and ethics education. Please, you can start.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, to Western Galilee College, and for the privilege of being part of this really fascinating conference. I'm going to now share my screen and show some slides. Okay, so I titled this talk "A Race Against Time," and we know that the race against time was lost for far too many people, but there was an opportunity at the end, toward the end, in the final year of the war, for those who were young and strong and picked to work, that fell within that category, and that somehow evaded the gas chambers, mostly at Birkenau, and somehow survived the death marches toward the end, which I will describe. There was maybe a little bit of a race against time, a little bit of an opportunity there. And of course, everything was very much intertwined with the Second World War, with developments that were happening during the war. So I was always very interested in the Holocaust, and I realized I didn't really understand the effect of the battles that were taking place and the evolution of the war on the Holocaust, the interrelationship. So this talk is going to zoom in a granular way and into two protagonists that I wrote about in my book. And through them, we get the larger story, we get the greater context, and we get the picture of what was happening in this last year of the war. So I'm going to talk here about Brigadier Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, who was the Deputy Director of Medical Services for the entire British Second Army, who wound up, like we're looking in retrospect, right, who wound up being in charge of relief efforts at Bergen-Belsen. And here's a picture of him at Bergen-Belsen. He's 52 years old. You could sort of see the serious look in his eyes. And it's through his journey in that last year of the war that we get a picture of what were some of the things that were happening, and that was what was consuming someone high up in the hierarchy in the medical services of the British Second Army. And here you see on the right-hand side, Rachel Guinuth, and that is my mother. And this exploration comes out of the question of how exactly and precisely did she survive. And this is the first picture I have of her. It was probably taken 5 months, maybe after the war, or 4 months. She is 15 years old, and you can see that she still has bruises under her eyes. She was very severely beaten up after the liberation, and this is her story of barely surviving. So how do things start out? Well, the journey of these very disparate protagonists is what the journey of so many were like at this point in the war. This is the spring of 1944. Here is Glyn Hughes in the Yorkshire Wolds in northern England, where he is a stalwart for preparedness, and he is at this point directing the British Second Army's 8th Corps, and having medical personnel, nurses, doctors, orderlies practice taking down and setting up casualty clearing stations and regimental aid posts, and really precisely figuring out how long does it take to set these up and preparing for the number of casualties they're going to have. And here is my mother starts out in Sziget, and she is part of the vast Hungarian deportation in the spring of 1944, where Hungary, for a long time, Miklos Horthy, the regent, didn't want to give up the Jews of Hungary, though he wasn't exactly friendly to them, but he didn't want to give them up to Hitler. But he was coerced, he was practically forced in the spring of 1944 to appoint an anti-Semitic prime minister, and this was the most rapid, largest mass murder in human history, when you're talking about 440,000 Jews from the Hungarian provinces taken to Auschwitz. So my mother's journey begins here, and in the fall of 1944, she's probably, spring of 1944, she's sitting down to the Passover Seder with her family. So the Yorkshire Wolds, I'm just going to show you really quickly. They were chosen as a place for practice because the topography was supposedly resembling what the British would encounter in Normandy after the invasion. But of course, the hedgerows here and the fierce Panzer fighters really threw them. It was very difficult first battles. And just starting out in Sziget, sadly, we don't have a single picture of my mother or her family from her childhood. But at one point, I did ask her to draw from her memory a map and explaining where her apartment was, stretching between Timar Utsa and Kigya Utsa. And Elie Wiesel's house was about over here. My mom's apartment was here. It was in the poor section of town, supposedly the Jewish section. And my mother's town, where my mother lived, fell within the ghetto boundaries, and Kigya Utsa was the first place where they lined the Jews up and started to march them first to one synagogue and then another, and then to the train station to be taken to Auschwitz. And this is a beautiful town. This is an old postcard of Sziget, and I did go back right before the pandemic. I did go to see it, and of course, the Jewish character of the town is completely wiped out. There's nothing left except the mountains haven't moved, right? And the streets haven't moved. So I could try to trace some of the journeys my mother took as a sort of street smart kid. And she had a hardscrabble childhood and a lot of responsibility, was the second of 6 children. And I could kind of figure out where she went when she was delivering orders for her butcher grandmother to all the Jewish households in Sziget. And here you could see that where she was from was taken over, it became part of Hungary, was annexed by Hungary when they invaded in 1940. And then we're going to fast forward. I will show you just a few points on the timeline, this race against time timeline. And one of them was on June 6, 1944, which we know was D-Day, the magnificent armada of Allied forces landing, 7,000 boats, 150,000 troops landing on the beaches of Normandy in a surprise invasion. And this begins the a sort of part of the race, right? And we know that on this day, by this day already, so many lives have been lost. We're talking, I mean, if we focus in on the Hungarian deportation, we already know that 90% of the Polish Jews have been wiped out. We know that about the death camps that have been operating for years. And world leaders knew about what was happening and about the preparations in Auschwitz for the Hungarian deportation, but nothing. We learned yesterday about the conversations around destroying the railways or bombing Auschwitz, and we know nothing was done. Anyway, on June 6, 1944, we had about 4,414 deaths among the Allied troops landing in Normandy, and we had more than twice the number of Jews being killed on that day in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And here is a picture. You probably all heard of Lily Jacobs and this album, the SS Officers album that she found. And it had like 192 pictures in it, which are the most valuable photographs that were meant probably taken by the SS photographer to show the efficiency of the killing process of these arrivals, but they also provide now a kind of testimony that this album was recovered, and it's really the only known photographs. We have very few that were taken by the Sonderkommando by a miracle, but you can see these people don't really have no idea where they are landed and how efficient it was. And you could see maybe a mother talking to a child, a man turning to a man. They're trying to figure out what planet they landed in after very torturous journeys on these cattle cars. And here you see more pictures from that album, people being led to the gas chambers. And my mother would say here, these women were already lucky because they had scarves. She didn't have a headscarf. And here you see a photograph from Canada, the vast place. Canada is a vast land, the vast amount of goods that people brought into Auschwitz. But more than twice the number of people were killed here, at least 9,000 on June 6th. And the number continued every day through July 9th. And the killings continued on and on into the fall, and even as late as the winter in Auschwitz, whereas the casualties in Normandy and the fighting, as horrible as devastating as the battles were, the numbers decreased day after day. And now I'm just going to show you I just lifted from the archives just a couple of pictures to illustrate the kinds of things that the British Second Army, the medical corps was interested in, what Glyn Hughes was consumed with, some things from his album, and to show what was going on. So here you have D+1, D+2, D-Day, plus the number of days. And he's talking about how many casualties there were on the beach and how many drownings there were, and calculating and then figuring out where he could commandeer hospitals in the area and how many beds they had and what type of special units he had to bring in to deal with people, mobile neurosurgical units, maxillofacial surgical teams, and everything was a very precisely planned. So there were two things going on. One is he was consumed with details and preparedness, as I said, down to like how long a surgery would take, down to the number of seconds it would take. And on the other hand, there has to be a lot of improvisation and resourcefulness, figuring out where you can get hospitals, taking a look at the aerial photographs all the time, and trying to figure out how to evacuate soldiers, where the airplanes could land, lots of details. And also from his album, you could see, there was so much document, so many photos, so many top secret papers, but I've only lifted a few to show you, just going into Normandy, into France, into Belgium. And here in Holland, you could see the celebrations as the towns are being liberated. But I can tell you that what was one of the things that were so surprising to me in my research was in August of 1944, in the summer, right, when already most of the Hungarian Jews from the provinces were already exterminated. By this point, and again, it was a race against time to save some who had been siphoned off for labor, because Hitler looked at this population as there was a severe labor shortage. Germany was already, we know, losing the war, and he was going to siphon off from these deportees to Auschwitz the young and strong. And here it was going to be, from among the Hungarians, it was going to be the young women from ages of maybe 16 to the late 20s, early 30s, who did not have children. unless they were somehow gave up their child at the ramp to a grandmother, which the Sonderkommando tried to urge them to do. Anyway, mostly women, some young men, but most of the young Hungarian men were in Hungarian forced labor. It was a unique wartime system, and the Hungarians weren't about to give up their help, their free labor, their slave labor so quickly until the end of the war, until about probably August 1944, they gave some to the Nazis to use. But anyway, in this part of this race against time, in that August, the world leaders were predicting, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill were saying, wow, we broke out of Normandy. We are going to end this war by Christmas. And here was the real race against time by Christmas. And how many more lives would have been saved had that come to be? Here's some more pictures. The battles took a long time. There was a surprise in the Battle of the Bulge in December, and this really set them back. The Nazis were going to give their full-fledged last effort, even though they were losing the war. And it took a long time. Finally, the British crossed the Rhine in March of 1945. And here's some soldiers surrendering. Here's a battle capturing Wessel right after. And apparently crossing the Rhine was as effortful and dramatic as the Normandy invasion. So things did not go as smoothly as planned. They encountered tremendous resistance, even when they got through the fortress of Germany and started to fight in Germany. And what was happening in the East, what was happening in the battles there, what was happening on the Eastern Front? Well, the Russians were slowly approaching, or quickly approaching, but still it was a race against time. They liberated Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945, and there were fewer among the three Auschwitz camps. The main camp, Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, and 600 in Buna, Auschwitz III, about 4 miles away from Auschwitz I. Here were the locations: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, and Buna, Auschwitz III. There were fewer than 8,000 inmates remaining. Why? Because the Russians were approaching, and now there were orders from on high that there were no prisoners that should fall alive into Allied hands, and about 60,000 people were marched out of Auschwitz in the middle of January. Who was left and remaining were the sick, those who couldn't march. And periodically SS would show up and take them and shoot them, but there were remaining about 8,000 by the time the Russians arrived. And here was another sort of race against time. But the death marches, where they had to be evacuated away from the Russian liberating armies coming from the East, another race, real race. And starting from Auschwitz, they were evacuated along two routes, walking about 30 miles north or northeast, and then put on these open cattle trains, and then transferred and dumped deep within Germany, away from the liberators. And one of the places that they were dumped was Bergen-Belsen, and Bergen-Belsen held the largest amount of deportees. So now I'm going to go quickly through what happened on April 15th, 1945. The British crossed the Rhine. They're fighting their way. There's battles in the area. An extraordinary development on April 12th. The Germans approached the British, the army commanders, and said, we have a concentration camp and we need you to go in. This is 3 weeks before the end of the war, because there are sick inmates who may break out and spread disease throughout the countryside, and it's in the interest of international health. And Glenn Hughes was one of the first people to come in. And I will just, in the interest of time, just go through quickly some of the images of what they found. I can tell you the British were totally shocked. Glenn Hughes, who was a war-hardened military hero from World War I and World War II, highly decorated, broke down crying. He did not know. Again, this was the largest concentration camp at the end. There were about 60,000 inmates here. There was no food, water, there was no habitable housing for these people. And you can just see they're just dying. And here's a few stronger survivors who were managed to get some potatoes and have a cookout. And you could see they're completely inured to the background scenes. And just very quickly, the Germans sabotaged the camp before they left. There was no water supplies. The Royal Engineers had to quickly set up a source of water, and they had to, the third day after the liberation, the 11th Light Field Ambulance came in and pitched a dump of tentage to get people out of these overcrowded huts where the dead and living were laying together in very bad shape. And if at least the ambulatory could get into these tents, they could get some food or a sip of water to the people in the huts, but they were very low on personnel, very low. And here they are trying to figure out how to distribute food. And again, the tents, and here's a war artist, Leslie Cole. He was in his early 30s at the time, but sometimes I think the photographs show a lot, but the grief you can really see in the paintings, in the art. And it's very significant to me, the distance between the tent and the hut, because just a brief anecdote, my mother wound up being expelled from the tent. At first, she was well enough to be in a tent with 4 of the girls. She got expelled because she was too sick when it was her turn to close the flap door, and had to crawl back to what the British called the hut, these groups. So there was a lot happening on the ground. The liberation wasn't like the British came in and the sun was shining and the sky is blue and everyone's cheering. Most of the people were too sick to give a rousing reception. And of course, there was no choice. And this was really a difficult decision for Glenn Hughes, what to do with the piles and piles of dead. And so they had built 13 of these, dug out 13 of these mass graves, about 12 feet deep, 20 to 30 feet wide, and 40 feet long. And here is Rabbi Leslie Hardman, the British military chaplain who came with the British Second Army, who is so bereft at the way people are being buried. And here he is with Isaac Levy, who came to help relieve him. So you had these 2 rabbis who had to say the Kaddish and prayers over these people. And here they pressed there was about 80 SS officers and Nazi personnel, Nazi functionaries who remained at the camp for the transfer. And here they are pressed into service to help clean up the place. And you have the burgermeisters coming from the town, the mayors and townspeople who are made to come witness what their countrymen have wrought. And the graves, there were these mass graves, and they were labeled 5,000, 10,000, 2,000. And honestly, there were so many dying. 500 continued to die every day after the liberation. It took a long time for the British to gain control. And this was mostly guesswork. And Margot Frank has a beautiful, and Anne Frank has they have a beautiful tombstone here, but I can guarantee you that's not where they were buried. So just really quickly, I don't have time, but if I did, I would talk a little bit about the moral motivation, the readiness to break rules. They couldn't abide by army policy, what they had to do to rescue these people. Again, it was a race against time on the ground here. Decisive action, compassion, and receptivity to unfolding phenomena. And they basically, what they did was they had to go hut by hut. They had men of the 11th Light Field Ambulance wearing these suits to protect them against typhus, which was raging. And they had to go hut by hut and take people to a nearby cavalry stables where they had 60 tables set up. They had to bring in, they had no medical person, not enough medical personnel. They brought in German nurses from the countryside to clean the inmates who were still breathing, who were surviving. They took them from the dirty huts, contaminated ambulances, and then they put them in clean ambulances and took them to makeshift hospital area. And you can just imagine the logistics of it. Like they Glenn Hughes accurately calculated that 25,000 people were in immediate need of medical attention, and he would be unable to save 14,000, and that was pretty accurate. But where do you get 15,000 blankets to wrap people in? So, and I just want to mention that they named, the inmates saw Glenn Hughes's compassion, and they named the hospital in the area the Glenn Hughes Hospital. So reading just from the bottom, 14,000 patients were in the Glenn Hughes Hospital, the largest such facility in Europe, on May 19th, 1945, 2 weeks after the more than a month after the liberation. It took 2 weeks for the backlog of corpses to be buried, and 500 inmates died each day. And I will end, I think, by just reading you this beautiful excerpt from one of the Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, who commanded the 11th Light Field Ambulance. It was shortly after the Red Cross arrived, though it may have no connection, that a very large quantity of lipstick arrived. This was not at all what we men wanted. We were screaming for hundreds and thousands of other things, and I don't know who asked for lipstick. I wish so much that I could discover who did it. It was the action of genius, sheer unadulterated brilliance. I believe nothing did more for these internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. You saw them wandering around about with nothing but a blanket over their shoulders, but with scarlet red lips. So I will leave it to you to think about that. I'll stop now, because I'm sorry I went over my time.
Thank you very much, Bernice. You were an exciting lecture. I felt at home because my mother was a survivor from Hungary. We are going now to the next and last lecture for this session. The lecturer will be Pierluigi Bolioli. I'm so sorry, I can't say it correct. I can understand.
You were correct. Pierluigi Bolioli, yes.
Okay, thank you. So Bolioli earned his master with a merit in modern history, with a thesis on the internment of enemy aliens during World War II in Italy. A little study topic, but closely connected with the history of European racism and the extermination of Jews. For his master thesis, he received the Grazia di Veroli Scholarship awarded by the Union of Italian Jewish Community and the Italian National Association of Deported in Nazi Camps, and the Tralireg Historia Prize, which includes the publication of a thesis. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Pisa in his final year. To complete his thesis, he spent a period of research at King's College London and in the Archive of London, Rome, and Geneva. His research interests include fascism, imperialism, Holocaust studies, international relations. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, can I share my screen? Yes.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you for having me. Yes. Okay, I think this is a little different topic than the other ones, but somehow is connected. First of all, I would like to underline the differences between the two systems, the two internment systems. They were actually impossible to compare with the Holocaust and the Gulag. Of course, there were different in size, scope, mortality, and living condition. Actually, the mortality was somehow low or very low, under 5%. And there were no extermination death camps, of course, in British Empire, while in Italy they were built and run by conjunctly by both fascists and Nazis, but only after 1943, of course, the collapse of the fascist regime and the invasion of Italy. Of course, there were mostly small camps, and incredibly, there was no total internment of Jews. This was one of the Mussolini's will, but it was never implemented. And only foreign Jews were interned in Italian camps. So we are talking just of them. Also in the British Empire, in the United Kingdom, to be correct, Jews were interned, those of German and Austrian, with German and Austrian nationality. All kind of buildings could be used as camps, of course, and the very few camps were built up for the purpose of interning foreigners. Another common feature was that in both systems, internees received a daily allowance to be used for food and other expenses inside the camp. And both in Italy and the British Empire, the ICRC and Swiss legation inspector were allowed inside the camp to check the condition of the internees. Of course, as I already mentioned, it's impossible to compare with the Holocaust. And but I think camps were really important to understand the role of Italy in the Holocaust and how much Italy did actually contribute to the Holocaust. Of course, the camps were part of a Nazi fascist plan to exterminate Jews, and concentrating, listing, and sizing Jewish assets in the end contribute to their deaths. Here you can see the platform 21. This is an underground platform in Milan used to transport Jews, and not only to Germany after 1943, of course. Nowadays is a Shoah memorial. Okay, the fascist concentration system was much more complex than the British one, of course, because it lasted longer. It was established in 1926 as confinement. This is maybe difficult to explain. Basically, confinement was aimed at Italians, also of Jewish origins, but not only. Most of them were politically opponents, while internment is aimed at foreigners, and most of the Jews were interned under these as foreigners. Okay, and also and this is why we talk about Italy, Fascist Empire, because also in the colonies there was set up camps to intern foreigners. So, and of course, okay, here you can see some example. I put this tray. This is some sort of famous tray because it was produced inside one of the camps by Ernesto Rossi, one of the a famous internee. So as you can see, it's the condition allowed somehow to also to produce some work of art. Okay, this is the same. Okay, while this is a camping colonial contest used to intern political partisans and other Ethiopian revolution. While this is a camp in Italy, of course, these were pictures taken both by Italians or by the ICRC inspectors. Okay, yeah. Okay, while the British concentration system was aimed mainly at enemy aliens, and was a global phenomenon, and was put in place in every colony and dominion, Trinidad, wherever, Australia, New Zealand. And of course, this is without, let's say, respect to the actual danger, the actual degree of danger that a foreigner could actually provide to the country. And the camps were divided on the basis of nationality, while in Italy they were not. POV camps aiming at prisoners of wars. There were also internment camps for political opponents, and the main internees were the members of the British Union of Fascists, the organization of Oswald Mosley. In 1939, there was the mass internment of Germans and Austrians, including Germans and Austrian Jews who actually fled the persecution of Nazi persecution, but these ones were released in 1940, but they spent almost 7 or 8 months in British camps, even if they were enemy of the Nazi regime. Okay, this is one of the camps in Canada. This is the réfectoire, the canteen, sorry. And this is another camp in Australia. And this is one of the camps in the Isle of Man. Most of the camps were actually built in a colonial context because it was easier to, let's say, avoid the stricter British rules. The Isle of Man is still nowadays a crown dependencies and has different judges and laws from UK. So coming to this topic of this the main topic of the article, of course, is the inter-imperial relationship, and somehow the two countries managed to maintain some sort of relationship. Italy declared war to France and UK in June 1940, and immediately both countries decided to intern all enemy aliens. And the two countries interrupted the diplomatic relationship, but they were nominated two protecting powers, the United States for English internees and POVs, and Japan for Italian internees and POVs in the British Empire. Of course, as you can imagine, on the 7th of December 1941, Japan bombed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and making it impossible for this country to access protecting power. So Switzerland takes on the same role for both countries. And as I mentioned, both countries allowed inspection from ICRC and the Swiss legation. Okay. Yeah, this is the document showing an inspection from the ICRC in the Ferramonte di Tarzia camp in Italy. And this is one of the documents in which Switzerland take on the role of protecting power for Italy, I think. I'm not sure. Yes, for it. Yeah, in conclusion, the two systems are incomparable to the Gulag and the Holocaust, and they were substantially similar, and the living condition inside the camp were alleviated by the possibility of receiving help from outside. In the Italian case, but I think also in the British case, also Jewish organizations were allowed to give aid and support to Jewish internees inside camps. However, Italian contribution to the Holocaust remains a line of research that is still little explored, and also maybe it's interesting to understand how much Italy was an anti-Semitic country. And then, but in the end, the two countries were able to maintain a sufficient diplomatic relation through Switzerland and the other protecting powers. Thanks.
So thank you very much. Boaz, what's going on now?
We have time for questions.
Okay. So,
I would like to ask if I can. So I'll go. Actually, Pam and Bernice gave us the British angle of the Holocaust, or a certain angle, and so in one sense, if I understood right, Pam, you said, and correct me if I didn't get it right, the ideas that the Jewish organizations brought to the table to the British government or tried to push were totally out of touch with reality. But they did a lot. So we should not judge them according to certain activists' expectations, but with what they had, they did quite a good job. But again, on the other hand, their ideas were totally not in place. So I would like you if you can elaborate about this more. On the, just a minute, I'll just ask all my questions in one. And Bernice, I was thinking that, look, from what I learned about in my connection, my first lecture in Britain was, I think, or my second was in the royal commemoration ceremony to Bergen-Belsen liberation in the Imperial War Museum. That was 2004, maybe. And it was very impressive. I mean, when you talk about the Holocaust with British people, there are two issues they did well. Kinder transport, which of course now is challenged by historians, and kinder transport and liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And what I was asking, I wanted to ask you, you were showing that actually the British were well prepared in the sense of good medical services in the army to tackle the challenge of Bergen-Belsen. But actually, this was not that they were preparing for taking care of civilians. This was a military medical service, honing its ability to work with army casualties. So how do they do this change from, so, I mean, this is a change of a set of mind. You have to change your whole trajectory when you change from taking care of your own casualties or foreign civilians that may be Jews, but are still not us. So how did this work out?
okay, so if someone want to respond to Boaz's question, it's one way. If someone want to respond to other or to share another thinking, you are invited. Everyone can arouse the end. I saw you, Yitzhak Kerem. Please, you can.
No, but maybe take answers from. Okay, let's.
No, but there is some kind of comments. I don't know if people want to share their
No,
So
but I
everyone who want will raise the hand, and I will. Yitzhak, I saw your hands, but you are mute. Yes.
All right, responses to the three very challenging and
Okay.
good papers. First, and I present the case of Ben Arduz. He was Jewish, Sephardic, and elite. He gave out 6,000 visas from the Dominican Republic, okay, from the embassy in London. He had to smuggle them out, and part of the problem was that the people who got them couldn't use them. So only 700 people got to Saussure in the Dominican Republic. That's number one. Number two, about Bergen-Belsen, in terms of the historiography, and we interview survivors, the overall impression is the British obviously were shocked. They didn't know what they were doing, but the problem was they overfed the survivors, and many died of, whatever you want to call it, of their stomachs exploded. They weren't capable of eating, and there was no cognizance of the danger. And so in the paper that wasn't mentioned. I hope it was mentioned a little in the book. I want to see the book. And lastly, you can't generalize about the altruism of Italy. In general, the Italians will say we're a light Axis partner. But in many cases, there was official policy to actually be as evil for the Jews as the Nazis were, in some cases, okay? And then it also depends on the temperament and the ideological orientation of the military or civil, but usually military officers. So in Chado, in Libya, when 611 Jews were killed, it was an intensive, the commanders had the intent to bring the Jews to their death. The commander twice announced that he wanted to kill the Jews in the Pell, okay? And he broke them down. The Jews also were free to have kosher food, to bring in supplies, to pray, everything which you talked about. But in the Balkans, it gets dicey. In Athens, the Italians actually had a tough rule against resistance and partisans. Then, of course, when the Axis broke, they were pursued as POW. Many were killed, okay? But, for example, in the case of Albania and Kosovo, which now we're only learning about because Albania was like North Korea for many years, and we didn't know anything about it. The Italian regime in Kosovo incarcerated local Jews, Jewish refugees, plus Jews from the new areas which the Axis power occupied in Montenegro. So Italy, they took down the camp in Pristina and sent all the Jews to Berat to a camp, and then they released them. So that they saved those people, which was a big feat. But on the other hand, they deported back to Serbia various groups, and those people immediately were killed in Serbia locally, and also in the camps in Belgrade, in Savas and Topskova Shupe. So Italy, this is based on acute research. So if you're not in tune with really what's happening in the concurrent research, so this is beyond, for example, Sarvati and Picciotto's scope. They did many things, okay? But so these exceptions are significant, and Italy still doesn't want to reckon with the Holocaust and compensation, and has made it difficult and continually does. The Jews, obviously in Rome, but mainly in Milan, commemorate the Holocaust. But these are sore topics, and Pierre, I hope we're in touch.
Thank you. Anyone else? Maybe The lecturer want to add something?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I think, yeah, I think I need,
Okay.
yes, for sure, yes, this camps where I was talking about were mostly for civilians, and I decided not to include the prisoners of war. I also reacting to the chat, and of course, yes, the situation differs vastly between what happened in Italy and what happened in the Balkans, where the situation was under control of the military and not the government, the Ministry of Interior. And yes, it's a huge topic, I guess, still now in Italy, because I think actually Italy did a lot have a major role in the Holocaust and the extermination of Jews, but still it's difficult to understand how much and how deep was involved in the extermination.
נילה רוצים לענות.
What? מה? You are mute, Boaz, if you are speaking.
I'm saying that I would like to hear Pam and Bernice because I asked them a question and you
No.
didn't give them a
This is
chance.
what I asked the lecturer to respond.
Yes,
to
well,
the
I'm waiting.
question.
I'm happy to respond. I'm just waiting for the okay.
Okay, yeah.
You've absolutely framed everything that I said, and you got to the point. I'd just like to mention about the Kindertransport. I think it might be quite well known today. The only reason the British government allowed 10,000 Jewish children into, well, it's less than 10,000, was other children as well, majority were Jewish children, is because they didn't want them to go to Palestine. And this was a way of deflecting the whole Palestine question. So I know everyone says, oh, the British government was so wonderful. There was a pragmatic reason there. As far as the point that you very well picked up, and exactly that's the whole point of my talk, the Anglo-Jewish leadership has come under a lot of criticism that they didn't do anything, that they were insecure, they were worried about anti-Semitism. The revisionist historians have tried to compare them to the American scene, and it was not the same. In Britain, the Anglo-Jewish leadership, I say, was out of their depth, and they were fighting against, well, they weren't fighting, they were presenting a case to a country, a government that was fighting a world war. And unfortunately, as I say, and British policy and British priorities was not the Jewish question. It was to win the war, and they kept saying to them, let us win the war, that's the best way we can help the Jews. But I felt very much that it needed a revision to see what was done, and they really did try. And I mean, I've been through many, many documents of the Board of Deputies, the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, and the comments that are made in the minutes really show that they looked down on them insofar as they were really not on the same level arguing. And I think still at the end of the day, we have to give the Anglo-Jewish leadership credit for what they tried to do. And just remember that the war was a priority for the British. Jewish question was very low down on the priority list.
Yeah.
Okay, positive conclusion.
And I'll answer
Okay.
Boaz's
Yes.
question to me. Boaz, you also hit on what a point I was trying to make is that the British medical services were excellent, and they did treat some civilians along the way. They did, when they were leaving Holland, they had to quarantine people. They did also care about civilians, and they knew that there were POW camps. They knew they would come across concentration camps, but they had no idea about Bergen-Belsen, and they had no idea about they were told during the negotiations there was about 1,500 typhus cases, and that's why the Germans wanted to turn over the camp. They were prepared for a very limited scope, a little limited problem that they'd have to deal with. They were totally shocked at what they came upon. And that's why I mentioned that Gloomhughes broke down crying, and they didn't have, there was still, the war was going on. They didn't have the medical personnel. And yes, some of the British soldiers that did come in were very sympathetic and generous, and they gave to these starved people whatever rations they had on them, chocolate bars or Spam, and the shriveled intestines could not take it. More than 2,000 people died after their first meal after the liberation. But there were other people who realized what was happening, and they ran in and they ran into the huts and they said, don't eat, and they tried very hard to give watered down rations, and they called in experts in famine, and they worked up different types of diets, but it was really hard to give one-on-one attention and control what was happening on the ground.
I can add something that it's very interesting that in the Warsaw Ghetto, the physicians did a research about the hunger disease, and there is a chapter also dealing with the way how to act after you want to change the situation, and they come to very excellent conclusion from the science aspect how to deal with this with the people in this situation, from the nutrition and all the aspect. And unfortunately, no one knew about it immediately after the war. The book was the research was published after most of the physicians were deported to the extermination camps, and on 1946 it was published, but it was too late to help and to do whatever need to do in this situation. This is amazing, this excellent conclusion. They were pioneer in the field of this subject.
Okay. Daniela?
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, and thank you, Miriam, for moderating it. I suggest that now we should take a break and reconvene at 7:30 for our last panel, okay? You can stay on the Zoom. So see you at 7:30 Israel time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.